Night crept over Red Canyon like a slow-moving shadow, swallowing the last streaks of sunlight bleeding across the desert sky. The wind came first, brushing through the empty street with a hiss, lifting sand from the ground and dragging it across the wooden porches like invisible fingers searching for something lost. Lanterns flickered along the boardwalk, fighting against the dusk with trembling flames that glowed weakly through dusty glass. A stray horse snorted near the hitching post, stamping at the cold seeping into the air. Inside the saloon, the world felt tighter, dimmer, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Men who had spent the day riding cattle trails or chasing gold now slumped at tables with half-empty glasses of whiskey sweating beside their hands. Their voices rose and fell in unruly laughter, blending with the creak of chairs and the low hum of a piano missing two keys. Somewhere in the corner, a card game teetered on the edge of violence, as card games often did in these parts. The bartender polished a glass with the slow, bored rhythm of a man who had stopped expecting anything good for the night. It was the kind of evening the old folks later described as the beginning of one of those stories whispered around campfires, half caution, half legend, when something dark was about to stir and only the brave or the foolish stepped forward to meet it. The saloon doors groaned as they swung open, letting in a sliver of night wind and a figure wrapped in a faded, earth-tone blanket. The woman moved quietly, her steps deliberate yet soft, as though she understood the weight of every pair of eyes turning toward her. Ayanna kept her face lowered just enough to hide the flicker of alertness behind her dark lashes, but not enough to appear afraid. Her long black hair, braided with care, brushed her back with each step she took toward the counter. Men nudged one another, their whispers sliding through the room like needles. Some spoke with crude curiosity, others with disdain, all of them too loud. Ayanna ignored them with practiced grace, though the tension tightening her shoulders betrayed the unease settling into her bones. She had come only to buy provisions, flour, salt, and maybe a coil of rope, but she walked into a room where peace was as fragile as a dry twig. As she waited for the bartender to gather what she needed, the faint light caught the necklace she wore, a small carved talisman hanging from a worn leather cord. It was simple in design, yet unmistakably sacred to the tribe she belonged to. The moment it glinted, the whispers turned into something uglier. At the back of the saloon, Clay Maddox lifted his head from his drink. His eyes were small and watery, framed by the stubble and dust of a man who had long stopped caring how he looked. Around him lounged four men just as mean, their shirts dotted with old stains and the kind of arrogance that came from too many nights holding guns and too few facing consequences. Clay pushed himself upright, his boots dragging across the wooden floor with a scrape that cut through the noise. "Well, look what wandered in off the reservation," Clay drawled, spitting a glob of tobacco onto the floorboards. His men snickered, leaning back in their chairs to watch. "Ain't seen one of your kind walk in here alone before. Brave or stupid?" Ayanna didn't respond. Her jaw tightened for the briefest instant before relaxing again. She pressed a small pouch of coins onto the counter, hoping the transaction would finish quickly. But Clay wasn't done. He sauntered closer, each step slow and deliberate, as though savoring the growing tension. "Hold on now," Clay muttered, reaching out as if he had every right to do so. "That little trinket of yours looks mighty valuable. How about you let me take a better look?" He reached for her necklace, but Ayanna stepped back, her eyes snapping up to meet his. They were sharp, steady, and cold enough to stop a weaker man in his tracks. Clay was not a weaker man. He was cruel, reckless, and drunk enough to mistake her silence for submission. "Don't walk away from me," he barked, grabbing her arm. She didn't cry out, though the grip left a blooming mark on her skin. The room stilled. Even the piano fell silent, as though the instrument itself knew this was no ordinary scuffle. One of Clay's men laughed. "She don't speak English, Clay. Maybe you gotta show her how we do things in civilized places." Another leaned forward, his voice dripping malice. "Cut that necklace off her. Might fetch a fair price." Ayanna's gaze darted around the room, bartender frozen, patrons staring but unmoving. No one would help her. Not here. Not tonight. The saloon doors banged open with a crack of cold wind, snapping every head around. A man stepped inside, tall and worn by the world, with dust clinging to his coat and boots that looked like they had walked farther than most men dared ride. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but even from a distance something about him radiated authority and danger. He paused only long enough for the door to swing shut behind him before continuing inward, the sound of his boots echoing like measured drumbeats. Jonas Crow looked like a man who had known violence intimately but carried it with the quiet control of someone who feared what he might become if he ever let go. His expression was unreadable, but his presence shifted the saloon's air, drawing unease from the rowdy man who had dominated the room only moments before. Without hurry, without a word, he moved toward the counter, though his eyes, dark, alert, were fixed unmistakably on Clay's grip around Ayana's arm. Clay noticed. He turned, smirking, as though seeing Jonas as nothing more than another face to impress with his cruelty. "You got business here, stranger?" Clay asked, puffing up his chest. Jonas didn't respond at first. He set his gloves on the counter, the gesture slow and deliberate. Only then did he turn his head, his gaze landing on Clay with a calmness that felt like a warning in itself. "Let the woman go," Jonas said, his voice deep but steady, quiet but carrying across the room like the crack of a whip. No theatrics. No threats. Just an instruction spoken as if he assumed it would be followed. Clay laughed loud, the sound harsh and brittle. "Or what? You gonna preach me to death?" Jonas didn't blink. Once. The word hung in the air with chilling simplicity. Clay blinked in confusion, drunken bravado wavering. Jonas's hand hovered near the inside of his coat, but it wasn't quite touching the handle of a gun. Not yet. He stood perfectly balanced, every line of his body suggesting that he could react faster than any man in that room if he needed to. The other patrons leaned back instinctively, as though giving space to a storm gathering in human form. Clay tightened his grip on Ayana's arm. "I ain't letting nothing go unless I damn well feel like it," he sneered, jerking her closer. "Now who the hell do you think you are, walking in here with that tone?" Jonas stepped forward. Just one step. But it was enough to make the wooden floor creak under his weight. Enough to make Clay's sneer falter. Every eye locked onto Jonas. Every breath held. The room, once loud and unruly, fell into a silence so sharp it seemed to carve itself into the walls. No one knew the stranger's name. No one knew where he came from or why he walked into Red Canyon that night. But as he stared down Clay Maddox, cold, steady, unflinching, everyone felt the same thing stirring in their bones. Something was about to happen. And the night, already dark, was about to turn darker still. Clay Maddox's fingers dug deeper into Ayana's arm, but his smirk wavered as Jonas Crow stepped closer, shadows shifting across the stranger's weather-worn face. Jonas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words came quiet, steady, and immovable as stone. "Let the woman walk." The gang burst into laughter, the sound sharp and sloppy, fueled by whiskey and arrogance. One of Clay's men slapped the table as he cackled, his teeth yellow under the lantern light. Another leaned back in his chair, arms stretched wide, mockingly bowing toward Jonas as if greeting royalty. "Well now," Clay sneered, leaning in close to Ayana as though she were a shield, "we got ourselves a hero. A half-dead wanderer thinking he can tell us what to do." Jonas didn't react. He kept his eyes on Clay, their cold stillness cutting through the noise like a blade through cloth. Only his jaw shifted, tightening ever so slightly. "I'll say it once more," he replied, each word placed with the weight of a verdict. "Let her walk." Clay's laughter came harsher this time, laced with a flicker of unease. "Or what?" Jonas didn't blink. "Or you won't walk away from this." Silence rolled through the saloon, heavy and suffocating. Even the drunks sensed something dangerous rising between the two men. Ayana's heartbeat thudded in her ears, but her face remained poised, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Clay's temper snapped like dry twine. With a roar, he lunged forward, his fist cutting through the stale air toward Jonas's jaw. But the punch never landed. Jonas moved with a swiftness that didn't match his rugged exterior. He stepped aside, seized Clay's wrist, and drove his other fist into the outlaw's ribs with explosive force. Clay folded, breathless. Before he could recover, Jonas struck again, one precise blow to the jaw that sent the gang leader flying across two tables and crashing onto the floor in a heap of shattered wood. Gasps erupted across the saloon. Chairs scraped back. Guns flashed half out of holsters. The piano player dove behind the instrument as if it could save him from bullets. Ayana slipped toward the darkest corner, her feet silent, her breath measured. She watched Jonas with a mixture of fear and something else, something older, buried deep, waiting to surface. Clay's men surged forward. The first swung a bottle. Jonas ducked beneath it, grabbed the man's arm, and slammed him face first into the bar. Glass exploded across the counter. The second man barreled toward Jonas with a shout, swinging wild punches fueled by rage rather than skill. Jonas parried, his movements fluid and efficient, then drove his elbow into the man's temple. He dropped like a sack of grain. Another outlaw drew a revolver. The crowd ducked, chairs overturned, men scrambled behind tables. But Jonas was already on him. He kicked the man's wrist with a sharp snap that sent the gun spinning into the air. Before it hit the ground, Jonas caught it, emptying it of bullets with a flick of his hand, tossing the useless cylinder aside. The fourth man wasn't as reckless. He pulled a knife, the blade gleaming in the lamplight, and rushed Jonas with a howl. Jonas dodged, grabbed the man's arm, twisted with a precise, merciless motion. The outlaw screamed as his wrist cracked, the blade dropping to the floor. Jonas shoved him backward, where he fell clutching his mangled hand. The room was a storm of chaos. Bodies toppled over tables, lanterns swung dangerously, spilling trembling shadows across the walls. Men who moments before had mocked the native woman now crawled beneath furniture, too frightened even to look up. Only one outlaw remained standing, shaking yet desperate, his eyes darting toward Ayanna. He grabbed her by the hair. "No closer," he screamed, pressing the barrel of his pistol against her head. His hand trembled. Sweat dripped down his cheek. "You take one more step, old man, and she dies." Ayanna didn't flinch, though the metal dug into her scalp. Her eyes locked onto Jonas's with steady defiance, as though telling him not to hesitate. Jonas's expression changed. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was something colder, an ancient stillness settling into his bones. He stepped forward. The outlaw jerked the gun harder against Ayanna's head. "I said stop." Jonas didn't stop. He didn't blink. His right hand slipped behind his coat, just enough for his fingers to find the grip of the revolver holster beneath. A breath passed. The outlaw screamed a threat. Someone in the saloon prayed under their breath. Jonas moved. His arm blurred, faster than thought, faster than instinct, faster than the outlaw's finger could tighten on the trigger. The gun cleared the holster and fired before the sound even registered. Ayanna felt the air tremble. The outlaw's pistol split clean in half. Metal screamed as the weapon shattered, pieces clattering across the floor. The men stared dumbly at the broken handle still in his grip before collapsing backward in shock. Silence fell so suddenly it felt unnatural. Dust floated in the still air like drifting ash. The bartender peeked over the counter, his eyes wide as saucers. Men who had mocked Jonas moments earlier whispered in awe. "He shoots like a ghost. No man's hand moves that fast. Lord save us." Jonas lowered his gun with calm precision and holstered it. Ayanna brushed the broken metal shards from her hair and stepped forward, her chin lifted, her dignity unbroken despite the violence swirling around her. The remaining outlaw scrambled away on hands and knees, too terrified even to stand. Clay Maddox groaned where he lay half-buried in splintered furniture, blood trickling from his lip as he blinked up at Jonas through hazy, drunken confusion. What kind of men are you?" he rasped. Jonas didn't answer. He offered Ayanna his hand instead. She hesitated for a heartbeat before placing her palm in his. His grip was steady, warm, reassuring in a way she had never expected from a stranger. When she rose to her feet, their eyes met, hers fierce with pride, his shadowed with something unreadable. Behind them, the saloon remained frozen in reverence and fear. Tonight, the town of Red Canyon had seen Death's shadow walk through its doors wearing a dusty coat and silence for armor. Tonight, they had seen a man whose legend would echo far beyond the creaking walls of a frontier saloon. And though none knew his past, all understood one thing with bone-deep certainty. Jonas Crow was not a man to cross. Not tonight. Not ever. The saloon lay in ruins, its silence broken only by the groans of men who had swaggered in with whiskey carriage and now lay sprawled across broken tables and shattered glass. Lantern light trembled along the floorboards, casting long shadows across the wreckage, chairs overturned, blood droplets glistening like dark rubies, and the lingering smoke of a gunshot hanging in the air so thick it tasted like metal. Ayanna stood near the counter, breathing hard but upright, her blanket torn at the shoulder where Clay had grabbed her. Jonas stepped toward her with steady, deliberate movements, offering his hand once more, not out of pity, but out of respect. She accepted it gratefully, and when he helped her stand, she bowed her head in a quiet gesture so full of dignity it softened the edge of the destruction around them. The bartender emerged from behind the counter, wiping his trembling hands on a stained apron. "Sir, thank you," he managed, voice cracking. But as his eyes drifted to Jonas's right hand, the one that had drawn faster than a blink. He went tail. Recognition flickered there, something between fear and reverence. Jonas caught the look but said nothing, merely adjusted the sleeve that had risen during the fight. Men hidden behind tables slowly rose, picking their hats off the floor as though afraid to make sudden movements. Eyes avoided Jonas's. No one wanted to draw his attention, not after witnessing what he could do. Bodies shifted, moaning as they tried to crawl away from a stranger who had dismantled an entire gang without breaking a sweat. But Ayanna did not shy away. She watched Jonas with a gaze that held caution, gratitude, and something hidden beneath, something heavy with memory. When the last outlaw finally crawled out the back door, Ayanna released a long, steady breath. The room felt strangely hollow now, as though a storm had passed but left its warning behind. She turned toward Jonas, her voice low, her first words threading through the dim room like a forgotten song. "I knew they would come," she said. Jonas looked at her, not surprised, not confused, but patient, waiting for the truth that she had carried like a burden. Ayanna stepped closer, fingers brushing the carved talisman at her throat. Her shoulders stiffened as if bracing against a wave of pain. "They killed my family," she continued softly. "My father. My brothers. They wanted our land, the land where our dead are buried. When we refused to leave, they burned our home." Her voice tightened, but her eyes did not waver. "I escaped. I've been running since." Jonas listened without interruption. His silence held weight, the kind that invited truth rather than demanded it. "They weren't just after the land," she said, lifting the necklace so its carved edges glimmered beneath the lantern. "This holds proof of what they did. Names. Agreements. The map they drew, all hidden inside. They thought killing us would bury their crime." Her fingers closed around a pendant, trembling with purpose. "But they didn't know I was still alive." Jonas stared at the necklace for a long moment, something shifting in his gaze. Not pity. Recognition. Behind them, one of the older cowhands who'd been hiding under a table finally stood. His eyes drifted to Jonas's hand, the one that had moved so fast during the fight. A faint outline was visible beneath a worn leather glove, faded ink embedded into the skin like a scar. A federal star, but drawn over with black, like a wound cut through a badge. Whispers began to ripple through the room. "That mark, that's a tracker's brand. A federal hunter." "No, look at the strike across it. That ain't no lawman anymore." Jonas pulled off the glove, tired of murmurs. The tattoo lay bare, a five-pointed star once worn by elite federal trackers, crossed out in thick black ink. A symbol of a man who had turned his back on the badge, or been cast out by it. Ayanna's eyes widened. "You were one of them." Jonas didn't look at the townsfolk. His gaze remained fixed on her, steady and unflinching. "Once." The bartender swallowed hard. "Crow. Jonas Crow, is that?" Jonas cut him off with a single look. But it was too late. The name had been spoken, and with it came the weight of an old legend carried by dust storms and whispered by outlaws around dying campfires. Ayanna stepped closer. "I've heard that name." Jonas breathed out, weary. "Most have heard lies. Some heard the truth. Depends on who's telling it." "Tell me," she urged. Jonas shifted his stance, leaning against the counter as though the memories pulled too heavily on his spine. "I was a tracker. The kind they sent after killers no one else could catch. I hunted outlaws for a living, until the day I hunted the wrong one." His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck straining. "They turned on me. The men I trusted. The badge I carried. Sold themselves for money and land. Same men who lead gangs like Clay's. Same network. Same rot." Ayanna felt a chill crawl through her. "They left you for dead." Jonas nodded. "Shot me. Buried me in a shallow grave. Took everything I had." He lifted his eyes to hers, something dark simmering beneath the surface. "Tonight, I saw the way Clay moved. The way they cornered you. The way they talked. They're working for the same men who ruined my life, and yours." The realization struck her like a sudden gust of winter wind. The same venomous circle of greed that had destroyed her family was the one Jonas had been hunting across the frontier. Fate had not thrown them together by accident. Ayanna lifted her chin. "Then we have the same enemy." Jonas studied her, as though searching for hesitation, fear, or doubt. He found none. Only fire. Only purpose. He pushed off the counter and stood tall, shoulders squared. "I'm finishing what they started." His voice carried the weight of iron. "You've got proof. I've got a score to settle." Ayanna stepped toward him, closing the small space between them. "Then I go with you." Jonas wanted to refuse. She could see it in his eyes, the instinct to protect, to push her away from the violence ahead. But he also saw the resolve anchoring her stance, the fierce steadiness in her gaze. She was no victim, no fragile wanderer. She was a survivor molded by loss, sharpened by the fire that consumed her past. "You won't turn back," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I cannot," she replied. For a long moment, the saloon held its breath as the two stood facing one another. Then Jonas nodded once, a gesture that sealed their pact as surely as a blood oath. They stepped out into the night together. The pale moon cast silver light across the empty street. The sky stretched wide above them like a dark canvas painted with stars. Wind brushed past, cool and purposeful, carrying away the last traces of smoke from the saloon fight. Side by side, they walked into the open desert. Two lives broken by the same shadow. Two hearts driven by the same hunger for justice. And somewhere ahead, waiting in the darkness, were the men who had carved scars into both their worlds, men who had no idea that the ones they had tried to bury were now coming for them. The desert swallowed their footsteps as Jonas and Ayanna moved toward the distant silhouette of the canyon, the moon pouring silver light over the land like a blessing from some forgotten god. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, the cry echoing between the towering red cliffs like a warning. Jonas adjusted the revolver at his hip. Ayanna touched the feathers on her quiver, a gesture not of fear, but of readiness. They followed the tracks left by the fleeing outlaws, footprints scattered in panic across the sand. Ayanna knelt often, brushing her fingers lightly across the earth, reading the land with a fluency Jonas could only marvel at. She could see the story in every scuff, every bent blade of desert grass, the weight of the men who passed, how fast he ran, whether he looked over his shoulder. "3 ahead," she whispered, pointing toward the canyon where jagged shadows twisted like serpents. "One limping." "Clay." Jonas nodded. "They're running scared." "They should be." Her voice was steady, but rage simmered beneath the calm, controlled, honed, sharp. As they approached the mouth of Red Serpent Canyon, the cliffs rose like titans, their walls streaked with layers of crimson and gold. Wind tunneled through the narrow entryway, creating a low, eerie moan. Jonas scanned the heights, every muscle taut. This place is a coffin waiting to close. Ayanna's gaze swept the sheer rock walls. "Then we will seal it." The two slipped into the canyon's throat, stepping between towering boulders that cast deep, cool shadows. The air smelled of mineral dust and old storms. Their footsteps crunched softly across gravel, every sound amplified by echo. Jonas's hand stayed near his holster. Ayanna's fingers rested against an arrow, ready to draw. The canyon widened suddenly, opening into a basin surrounded by cliffs so tall the moonlight barely kissed the ground. A stillness lingered, too heavy, too deliberate. Jonas stopped. "They're here." Gunfire cracked through the night. A bullet slammed into the rock beside his head, sending shards flying. Jonas shoved Ayanna behind a boulder as another shot rang out from the opposite ridge. Echoes ricocheted violently, confusing direction. The outlaws had chosen their ground well. Jonas crouched low, scanning quickly. 3 shapes moved among the rocks, their silhouettes darting between shadows. Ayanna was already drawing an arrow, her breath steady, her body poised. "Keep low," Jonas murmured. "They'll try to flank." 2 more bullets screamed across the canyon. Jonas rolled, drew, and fired twice, each shot deliberate, each one hitting the stone inches from the gunman to force them deeper into cover. "They're scared," Ayanna whispered. "They should be," Jonas replied. He sprinted toward a cluster of rocks. A bullet grazed his sleeve, but he didn't break pace. He slid behind the boulder, rose just high enough to sight his target, and fired. One outlaw cried out and collapsed, the gun flying from his hand. Ayanna stepped from shadow to shadow, silent as smoke. She moved with the fluidity of someone shaped by wilderness, her feet barely touching the ground. She spotted an outlaw creeping behind Jonas's flank, his revolver raised. Before the men could aim, Ayanna drew her bow, exhaled softly, and released. The arrow cut through the darkness like a streak of moonlight. It buried itself deep in the outlaw's chest. He staggered backward, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing into the dust. Jonas glanced at her from across the canyon, the faintest flicker of admiration in his eyes, then turned as a bullet whistled past his shoulder. Only one gun remained firing. Clay Maddox. Jonas followed the muzzle flash, moving through the canyon with lethal precision. Clay was hunkered behind a boulder, panting heavily, drunk, furious, and wounded. Blood stained his shirt from the beating Jonas had handed him back in the saloon. His hand shook, his aim wild. Jonas approached slowly, gun raised. But Clay was not done being cruel. With a sudden burst of desperation, he bolted toward a narrow ravine, slipping into a crack in the rocks. Jonas sprinted after him, but Clay disappeared around a bend. When Jonas reached the ravine's mouth, he froze. Clay had Ayanna again, his arm around her neck, his gun jammed against her temple. "Drop it!" Clay screamed, voice trembling with madness. "Drop your damn gun or she dies." Ayanna's breath came fast, but her eyes, those fierce, unbroken eyes, stayed locked on Jonas. This moment, this position, this grip. She had lived it once before. The nightmare returned in full force, clawing at her lungs. But she refused to break. She refused to be powerless. Clay pressed the barrel harder. "I swear I'll do it." Jonas didn't blink. He stepped forward, just enough for Clay to panic, then stopped when the gun dug deeper into Ayanna's skin. His voice came low and calm, as steady as a river stone. "Ayanna," he said softly, "don't blink." She inhaled sharply. Clay's finger tightened on the trigger. Jonas moved. The gunshot rang through the canyon with a thunderous echo that startled the birds from the cliffs. Clay staggered backward, eyes wide with disbelief. A single bullet hole marked his forehead, small and precise. He collapsed onto the ground like a puppet with its strings severed. Ayanna stumbled forward and caught herself, breath shaking, but untouched. Jonas lowered his gun with quiet finality. The canyon went still. Red dawn crept across the horizon, lighting the cliffs with a glow that seemed almost holy. Ayanna watched the sun climb upward, its first rays painting the rocks gold. Her heartbeat slowly steadied. Jonas approached her, checking for injuries. She shook her head softly. "I'm free," she whispered. Jonas nodded once. No victory cry, no boast, just a quiet acceptance of justice long overdue. They stood together in the growing light, surrounded by the silence of a night that had finally ended. Somewhere, distant voices would one day whisper about the stranger who walked into a saloon and changed everything. They would speak of the woman who stood beside him, unbroken and fierce. They would tell the tale with awe, with wonder, with reverence. For legends are not born from peace. They rise from nights like these. Nights when justice is carved in bullet and bone, and sunrise feels like a blessing earned.